But the trouble with string theory is it's supposed to be a theory of the way the world operates. And if the number of dimensions of space is just wrong, I can't take it seriously.
Now, does that mean we know everything? No. Does that mean that we have all the ultimate answers? No. Is Einstein's theory correct? Yes, it is. Is Einstein's theory the ultimate answer? No, it isn't.
When we try to secure the good, when we claim that we have knowledge of it, we end up constructing enemies who are opposed to us.
Do we really want what we think that we want? Our human activity, from nuclear physics through to poetry, is all about mistakes and surprises.
Ask how a Beethoven can throw away the rules of music. Ask how a Picasso can throw away the rules of art. He lives on the edge. He's on that edge, which is the edge between order and disorder. And those of us who've done it know it's great.
Now, when I first heard about it, in I guess the early 1980s, I found it a very exciting idea. It looks as though you could use these sort of, these surfaces, Riemann surfaces, as a replacement for things like Feynman diagrams in talking about quantum field theory. And it looked very like an exciting idea to me. But then it rapidly became, well, at least the story was, and I didn't understand it well enough to see why it had to be like this, that it only worked originally in 26 dimensions. So it meant that space had 25 dimensions and time had 1 dimension. My reaction was, okay, well, that's the end of it as far as I'm concerned, because space doesn't have that many dimensions. Of course, I understood that the idea somehow that several of these dimensions are tied up into little knots and things like this, but it just never struck me that this worked because, well, the argument was somehow you could never excite the degrees of freedom which are involved in these tiny little extra dimensions. It just didn't seem to me that was correct, because even though it would take a lot of energy to excite these degrees of freedom, that amount of energy was as far as the whole universe was concerned. I mean, you don't just do it locally, it would affect the whole universe. And the amount of energy that here, over the whole universe, which amounts to, say, a Planck scale energy, which is the sort of thing they were talking about, is ridiculously small. But I think the trouble with string theory is that there isn't any connection with observations, as far as I'm probably taking too strong a view here. But the mathematics, I mean, it's largely driven by the mathematics as far as I know, which is in itself is not an objection as far as I'm concerned. A lot of what I do is driven by the mathematics. But the trouble with string theory is it's supposed to be a theory of the way the world operates. And if the number of dimensions of space is just wrong, I can't take it seriously. And I mean, there are arguments why all these extra dimensions are hidden, and I don't think those arguments are right either. So I'm just left in a position where the problem is not so much, how much mathematics or how much physics or what. We're not talking about things which can be experimentally tested anyway, as far as I can see. If you could have a theory which had predictions, and these predictions could be seen to be right or wrong, that's what I understand about physics. But string theory seems to me driven largely by certain ideas which have importance in mathematics, but sort of irrelevant to the physics, really. As far as I know, there's places where string theory has had an impact on mathematics. Sure, it has, but it's not physics, as far as I can see. So the main trouble I have with string theory is I don't think it's physics.
I prefer a slightly safer approach, which is why don't we see how far we can push the general theory of relativity and see where it breaks. Because I really believe that the gaps and where the theory breaks really points out, as Sabina said, right, the quantum gravity, the quantum nature of macroscopic objects, there are lots of thorny problems there. So this is in many ways a slightly easier route I would take, which is, and I really believe that very soon we'll be able to push much further than we already have in terms of tests of general relativity, especially in the strong regime. So when you're testing general relativity, the Event Horizons telescope, for example, this is the telescope that produced the donut-shaped image of this black hole. in the center of a nearby galaxy. So that allowed us to test the predictions of general relativity at a few percent level, and we can push down. And I firmly believe that because I think that the theory isn't complete, it is going to break. And I think we are similarly at, technologically, in terms of instrumentation, computation, modeling, and understanding, we're at a place where we can get more accurate measurements and we can test the theory to greater precision. And I believe that it will break, and that break will show us what the next step really should be.
Gravitational waves were predicted, and then they were found. The Higgs boson was predicted, and then it was found. And when we say predicted, we know that we had a model. It may have been right, it might not be right, but then we had experiments that confirmed it. Now, does that mean we know everything? No. Does that mean that we have all the ultimate answers? No. Is Einstein's theory correct? Yes, it is. Is Einstein's theory the ultimate answer? No, it isn't. So that's where we are in science. And I think we are human beings doing science. We are subject to error. I mean, some more than others, admittedly. But and each physicist might think they are the center of the universe. But that doesn't mean that we are the center of the universe. And a good scientist is aware of that. So a good scientist is aware of what they're measuring, what they have the potential to measure, what they're doing that's theoretical. And there are certainly some ideas. I mean, Neil said we saw the visible universe. Well, by definition, the visible universe is what we can see. The age of the universe is finite. The speed of light is finite, which means we only have access to a finite amount. Does that mean there's nothing beyond it? Absolutely not. Does that mean we will know for sure what's beyond it? Probably not. Does that mean we can't speculate about it? Of course we can. But that's not the same type of science that we do when we're looking at the visible universe. So are we the center of the universe? Yes, we are, but so is every other point in the universe, because we think it came from some small point and it all exploded in some sense. And so we don't have to answer these questions, but the kind of questions, I think a lot of the problem we get into is because the kind of questions we tend to ask is, how did everything begin? What is the ultimate answer? The kind of questions we can answer is, what is the next step underlying what we know today? And that doesn't sound quite as exciting and quite as inclusive, and it's not, but it's something that we can do and we can trust.
In the prompt, there was the idea of experimental proof. And I guess we all know there's not going to be such a thing as a proof. That is, no matter how much experiment or whatever we do, we'll never be sure if we have the right physical theory. So the real question you want to be asking is not proof, but what makes a theory plausible? What makes it seem like it's worthy of taking seriously, either for the purpose of developing it or just believing it might be correct? And surely experimental and observational data and fit to that is an extremely important component, but it's equally obvious there are other components that have to go into it. I can make up a very silly theory right now that nobody should take seriously, but you can't raise a single experimental objection to it. It goes like this. The thing we call the gravitational constant, well, it's not really a constant, it's going to change tomorrow. Well, obviously, no existing experimental data runs against that because it says up until tomorrow, everything's fine, but tomorrow it's all going to go kaflooey. Now, nobody should take that seriously, but not because it fails experimentally yet. It doesn't have a sort of internal coherence that we would like out of a theory. We want our theory certainly to be at least logically coherent. We have problems like putting general relativity together with quantum mechanics because they don't really play together well mathematically. That's not an experimental problem, that's a theoretical problem. And if we find a theory where they fit together smoothly, that's good reason to take it seriously. That's not an experimental reason. It's interesting in the Higgs case because, of course, it took a long time to actually verify the Higgs, but everybody was expecting it to be there. I don't think anybody thought finding it was now the reason to take the theory seriously. They took the standard model with the Higgs perfectly seriously for very good reasons before that came out. It was great that it came out. Similarly, the observation of gravitational waves predicted a long time ago, took a long, hard experimental road to actually see the things. But everyone expected them to be there, and there they were. And finding them didn't suddenly give the theory a huge boost in confidence. So the interesting question is, as you get it becomes harder and harder to do straight experimental tests, you would have to rely more and more on internal coherence, certain simplicity considerations to bring up the plausibility of a theory. And it's an interesting question of how far that can go. I don't think there's a general answer to that.
Marika, you hinted at when you're doing purely theoretical physics, you might be looking at elegance and beauty of the theory. And I want to sort of raise something that the late Peter Lipton asked. Should we be looking for the likeliest or the loveliest theory? And is the loveliest a strong enough criterion to make it a successful theory?
Yes, so I think it's an interesting point, because it's one which is discussed quite a lot in physics at the moment. Of, so what is it? I mean, almost alluded to in the discussion was, people believe people have a strong confidence that a theory is on the right lines, even without experimental evidence. So for me, in a sense, the most recent example of a theory which was really a big jump, which had no experimental evidence, was Einstein's theory of general relativity, right? Because, the tests, the tests of solar system physics were really not what made people believe it. They believed it, I think, from the time it came out, and they believed it because of the elegance of the way that it kind of, unifies special relativity. It brought in electromagnetism. It kind of reduced to Newtonian theory in all the limits where the Newtonian theory had been tested. But ultimately, more than anything, I think it was the mathematical elegance, the way it came out. But now, as we move a century later, you can say, well, should a fundamental theory necessarily have elegance, symmetry, just because it's nice? So the obvious example over the last 40 to 50 years has been that we seem to see in nature two distinct categories of particles. Some of them have, integer spins, and some of them have half-integer spins. And there are theories that sort of say that there's some kind of symmetry which links these things. These things seem to be a priori quite distinct from each other, but there seems to be something, you could group them in a theory where they're actually kind of linked to each other. But we've seen no hints of this in experiments, so should we trust this? And if you just relied on experimental evidence, I'd say throw it out of the water. Now, the reason I would keep it on the table is it does seem to do some very conceptually elegant things for us, in that it does help us reconcile the paradoxes of combining quantum mechanics and gravity. You have to do a little bit more than use this symmetry. You have to do some other things as well. But it seems to help us to answer some of the open, big fundamental questions in physics. And so it stays on the table. But do we exclude other things that, do the same? No, we don't. We should leave everything on the table. And that's where I say you've got this, you've got this way to use your resources, right? You have to try and make judgments about what looks the most promising. As a string theorist, I have to say I have never said this is the only game in town, and no, you shouldn't. You shouldn't pursue it. It's as you say, it's completely the opposite, right? You want to pursue everything that's promising, but you almost have an unspoken mental list of why you think things are more promising than others. I'd like to see actually more theorists articulate, and actually they shouldn't say, well, Princeton and Harvard are following this. It shouldn't be sociologically driven. It shouldn't be that the big people in the field are doing it. They should be articulating for themselves, why is this the most promising avenue to explore?
A perfectly symmetric object, our natural view of beauty, for example, in architecture, a Greek temple, or a radially symmetric rose flower, or a completely regular crystal, cannot be the basis of genuine evolution of problem-solving living systems. That is also clear when we consider the limitations of our computers. When they follow perfectly determinate algorithms, they produce perfectly regular outcomes. That is why people who wish to succeed in longer-term predictions, for example in our weather systems, resort to adding noise to their computations. So the dilemma here is that perfect symmetry seems to be the very antithesis of creativity. It's static, it's unchanging. Does that mean that we have to change our concept of symmetry as a model of beauty? Return, finally, to a moment, the bacteria seeking to avoid annihilation by antibiotics, the cancerous tumours recovering aggressively from radio or chemotherapy, or our immune systems going into overdrive to produce new DNA sequences during a pandemic. The answer is that all of these harness disorder to generate a new form of order. So my proposal is the deepest form of beauty, of symmetry, if you wish, is precisely the symmetry between order and disorder. That, in my view, is the yin and the yang of the universe.
So would you say beauty sits at
the edge,
some balance between
the edge? And when we live on the edge, we are beautifully creative. Ask how a Beethoven can throw away the rules of music. Ask how a Picasso can throw away the rules of art. He lives on the edge. He's on that edge, which is the edge between order and disorder. And those of us who've done it know it's great.
The enterprise of science, I don't think, is a continuation of religion. For some people it is. If you have a lawn sign that says, I believe in science as the first tenet, you probably don't express, I believe in systematically criticizing and doubting everything, right? What you say is, this first thing in the list of beliefs that make me a better person if I believe in them. But science itself is an enterprise that is built around the idea that some things are only true or false, not right or wrong. And we are exploring the domain of true and false, not the domain of right and wrong, which requires a very different methodology. Whereas religion is not built around this. Religion is not built around the question, is it true that Jesus is born by a virgin? It's built around the question, it's the right thing to believe for you. And also I have other beliefs for you that will lead to a good conduct of life. So religion ultimately is very much about right and wrong. In a sense, it's more related to an ideology than to a science. And of course, after you remove religion from people's life, they still will have a need for spiritual guidance. And some people believe that the spiritual guidance should come out of a different church, someone that is more truthful, more objective, more rational. Maybe it's Harvard, right? And so I believe in science is just the expression that Harvard is a new church of Protestantism for some people, right? And there's probably nothing wrong with it. It's maybe better than other churches, but it's a church. And then there's also the question, should we continue to have a separation between church and state? And if Harvard becomes a church, or part of it becomes a church, who keeps doing the science for us? So I do see this postmodernist perspective, anything goes, and everything that makes you successful as an academic is permissible as long as your peers are doing this. I think that we run into trouble.
We're animals, we're not angels, and our brains have evolved for a world very different from this one. And so when our Stone Age minds get confronted with a global pandemic affecting billions of people, we can do poorly. So as one example, we're really bad at risk assessment. We use a heuristic where the salience of an event is a cue to how probable it is. And so we radically overestimate odds of low-frequency events like mass shootings and shark attacks, and radically underestimate the probability of highly frequent but more mundane events like heart attacks or strokes or deaths by alcohol. As another example, and this is part of what I wrote my book about, our moral decisions are strongly biased by emotions, sometimes leading us astray. So there's all sorts of laboratory studies showing that we don't like to deal with trade-offs when it comes to being good, to helping others. And we actually distrust people who make such trade-offs. And this is a serious problem, particularly now, given that any intelligent approach to lockdown, school closures, quarantines, vaccination has to involve a complex balance between cost and benefit. So if the question is, do we need to wise up and get more rational with our decision? The answer is absolutely. At the same time, I think we overstate how stupid we are. I think we're a lot more rational than we give ourselves credit for. And I'll make 3 quick points about this. First, 2020 has been an enormous success story for the paradigmatic example of human rationality, which is the practice of science. If there are still any skeptics in the world about whether science captures truths about objective reality, I'd be quite happy if you'd hand me over your vaccine when it's your turn to get it, because I personally am very low down the queue. Second, we have goals other than truth. So in the middle of the summer last year in the United States, there were large rallies for Donald Trump. And many people, including many epidemiologists, said these are going to cause many deaths due to infections, grossly irresponsible. 3 weeks later, there were much larger rallies for Black Lives Matter. And many of the same people, including many epidemiologists, were either silent about it or said, it's fine, don't worry about it. Now, this might look like irrationality, but it better reflects the fact that people have multiple goals. We have social and moral goals. Most of the experts, at least in the States, have liberal politics, and they thought the Black Lives Matter rallies were just, and the Trump rallies were not. And this is what dictated their response. Similarly, we shouldn't take people who reject these experts and necessarily say they're being stupid. Maybe they just recognize that these experts might have different priorities than their own. Finally, I agree, we're sometimes irrational, ruled by our hearts and not our heads. But we can also step back and deliberate over how well we're doing and try to get better at it. And this is a tremendously powerful form of rationality. And it's exactly what we're going to do now.
It seems to me that we need to talk quite a lot more in our educational philosophy and educational practice about the two most remarkable and important aspects of our mental activity, mistakes and surprises. If we were simply sitting in the hermetically sealed cell of our cerebral activity, making stuff up, there would be no mistakes and no surprises. No mistakes because our thinking would never run into anything difficult. No surprises because there wouldn't be something that we hadn't seen coming down the road. But our human activity, from nuclear physics through to poetry, is all about mistakes and surprises.
That's a very, very good point. And I do absolutely agree that one of the reasons one can take it that one is encountering something other than one's own thinking is that often one finds that something doesn't work or is wrong, and one has to say one's got a surprise.
Yes.
Do you think, like me, that one of the problems for the English-speaking world is that we only have one word for no, but in most other cultures there's more than one word. One means knowing facts in the sense of, from the outside, the left hemisphere, knowing that Paris is the capital of France, but also another kind of knowing, which only comes through experience of actually having spent a year or two in Paris. And, you know, they're Kennen and Wissen and they're Cornet from Savoie, but I gather from other people speaking many other languages that this is pretty much the case. But I think a lot of the wrongness with Anglo-American analytic philosophy comes from misunderstanding what we mean by no.
Gwbod and adnabod in Welsh.
Is that it? Yes. Thank you. I've learned something.
Adnabod having, importantly, the connotations of recognizing.
Recognizing, exactly. Not cognizing, but recognizing something that is there. Yeah.
It's again a reminder that we look back at our intellectual history and we iron out the difficulties, the diversities. And one thing that has always rumbled alongside the mainstream of Anglo-American philosophy is that tradition going back at least to the 17th century in English language philosophy of what's sometimes called probabilism, the idea that our knowledge is based on accumulating a whole wide range of acquaintanceship with things, out of which eventually comes an integrative solution that suggests itself rather than imposes itself. And from some of the Cambridge Platonists through to Bishop Berkeley in the 18th century, to Coleridge and Newman in the 19th century, and that I suppose you could say in some ways to writers like Iris Murdoch in the 20th century, as well as really surprisingly, Wittgenstein. All of these have notions of certainty and knowledge and conclusive knowledge that are very non-mechanistic, that always assume that there are things going on in my processes of learning that I will not be conscious of, but will nonetheless be determinative for where I get to, and where, to use an image I quite like, where I decide to put my weight.
Yes.
Is this a load-bearing way of moving through the world?
What Lacan calls enjoyment, jouissance, emerges out of a self-sabotage of pleasure. It is an enjoyment in displeasure itself. And I'm even more of a pessimist here in the sense that do we really want what we think that we want? Quite often what appears as an obstacle to getting what we want is really what sustains our desire. For example, I read years ago, I remember this, a biography of T.S. Eliot. You know, while his wife was, it's not clear, did he put her there? Was it really in a psychiatric hospital? He had a distant affair, it's only letters, it seems, with another lady. And all the letters were, oh, let's just wait for the moment when my wife will die, then we will be able to be together. You know what happened? When the wife died, they split also. And I think this is a general structure of our desire. Did you see maybe the François Truffaut film? It's old, you are too young to see it. Day for Night, La Nuit Américaine. There is a wonderful marginal scene there that I love. A guy, one of the cast, wants to seduce another script girl, whatever, I don't know. So their car breaks down. They go to a lake close to the road. And then the guy tells her, listen, I'm dreaming of having sex with you for days, all the time here. Now we are alone. Nobody knows that we are here. Why don't we quickly do it? You know what the woman does? She said, okay, why not? And started to pull his trousers down, her trousers down. And he is totally shocked. What do you mean? Just like that or whatever, and so on. So I think that this logic of detour and so on is part of our sexual games. You cannot go directly for it. It's very difficult. That's why Lacan characterizes the ethical position in psychoanalysis as do not betray your desire. Usually we do betray it. For example, it happened to me, a dirty detail, not problematic, don't be afraid. When I was young, I was in love with a girl. The link was that the girl had a father who was a philosopher, and the ritual was to arrive at her apartment, first to have a talk with her father, and then let's go out to her. But at a certain point, she dropped me, because she said, I got it. What you really want is the surplus enjoyment. It was the other way around from what it looked. It was not, father is just the detour. She told me, I was a detour for you. What you really enjoy is this. Let's call it intellectual foreplay, talking with her father.
I think it is possible to find rather broad, abstract universal principles of morality. And I think a generalized version of the golden rule is such a principle. So it's obviously not enough for a basic moral principle to say, put yourself in the position of someone else, because there are many situations in which many people are involved, and not only human beings, but also non-human animals are involved. So I think the correct principle really that I think is more or less universal is we should put ourselves in the position of all of those affected by our actions. Try to take on what the impact of our choice, if we're facing an ethical choice, is for everyone affected, weighing their interests impartially, considering what those interests are. So equal consideration for similar interests would be a way that I would put this. And I do think that this is a universal principle. I think you find it in many traditions. You certainly find the golden rule in many traditions. Go back to Confucius. You find it in the Jewish thinker around the 1st century, Hillel. You find it in, Jesus says it in one of the Gospels. It's in the Mahabharata, the Hindu text. And then when you get to more philosophical understandings of it, you do get something like judge your action from an impartial perspective, or would an impartial spectator approve of your actions? And so I see that as in a way, a principle that thinkers can come to if they think carefully and impartially about the basis of morality.
And am I right in thinking that while most people might root that principle in things like religious laws or the fabrics of the universe, where do you find the basis for this principle?
Yes, I don't root it in any religious teachings because I'm not religious. I find it in, if you like, philosophical reflection on the basis of morality. Some thinkers, like the great 19th century utilitarian Henry Sidgwick, thinks that it's a self-evident axiom that we can derive it as something that people who are thinking clearly and calmly will come to. And I think that there is something in that view. I think we can regard some of these basic axioms as self-evident, not in the sense that they strike everybody intuitively as the right thing to do, because our intuitions might be guided by our evolutionary past or by culture and might be misleading. But if we try to put aside those particular attitudes and prejudices and just think about the situation in an impartial way, I think we reach this point that everyone's interests count and similar interests count equally.
Should we conclude that dividing the world into good and bad is not just misguided, but actually dangerous? Tommy?
I would have to say that those kinds of binaries have been utilized throughout history largely as an extension of what one in-group or dominant ethno-group has thought reflects the qualities of themselves, and how they've utilized the notion of good, be it morality or even an independent systems of ethics by which we determine what the good, the bad, or the evil should be, to impose certain kinds of norms and structures on outgroups. It's fascinating to me because when you look at the whole history of Western thought, some thinkers like a Rousseau, for instance, would say that the idea of good and evil actually originates in civilization, when one wants to create a system of ethics by which we could evaluate and judge actions in individuals and ultimately groups. He thought this is one of the failures of the arts and sciences and the letters. So you're looking at a tendency, not of all of humanity, but I think particularly in Western humanity, to impose the good as an intuitive, that has an intuitive relationship not only to reason but to being, and to suggest that people who exist or the groups that exist within kind of the illumination of the good has the right to not only impose but rule over those who are bad, are evil, or don't have the same access to it. And I think this presents a very important quandary for how we think of our contemporary world and modern civilization, because now we're not simply having philosophical arguments or debates, in the agora or in forums where we're trying to come to a consensus about the values that we think constitute what is the good. But rather we're using economics, military might, politics, and violence to impress one specific notion of the good on others. And these hierarchies that we develop between each other, be it an in-group or an out-group, be it a political party or otherwise, exude a denigration, if not dehumanization, of the people we see on the other side. So the question isn't only in the danger, but it's kind of the processes, the mechanisms by which we want to actually secure the good in the world. When we try to secure the good, when we claim that we have knowledge of it, we end up constructing enemies who are opposed to us. So what becomes evil is not something that is obvious and intentional, something that's a brute fact of nature that simply imposes itself on everyone else equally, but rather what a particular group defines as the evil that they want to overcome. And that seems to be more akin to people defining themselves as semi-deities that have God's given right that's been ordained by something higher than themselves and us to understand why they have this natural ordained power to determine how reality in the world should be. So the question of good and evil isn't one merely of danger, but it's the kind of caricatures, the processes of logic and reason that are created by the presumed relationship that we have to morality. And even more dangerously, to presuppose that we create rules of this called ethics that allow us to somehow objectively intuit what these forms of morality would be, even at the expense of other people's existence.
You cannot, there is a register of lobbyists which is inadequately policed at the moment, but which needs to be beefed up, but which didn't exist a few years ago. So it's a constant progress of making the system more transparent and more resilient.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah.
Do you think, Jesse, this solution to that is going to be effective?
I have a lot of respect for Jesse, but I also have experience of recent governments attempting to get around the rules on paid lobbying. So I was shadow leader of the House the day that the actual leader of the House, someone called Jacob Rees-Mogg, was supposed to get up and propose a motion on behalf of the government saying we are going to sanction Mr. Owen Paterson for literally taking a large amount of money for a large amount of access to ministers, which is against our rules. He was quite properly, thoroughly investigated and found to have done that thing, and therefore was supposed to be subject to a sanction which we were supposed to vote on. And instead, the government proposed an amendment rewriting the rules retrospectively about whether or not he was allowed to do that. That undermines the feeling that the public can get that you are actually respecting the rules on paid lobbying. There should be no paid lobbying. There should be no paid lobbying. None. Absolutely none. It's not what we're there for. We're there to represent you. We should have an independent ethics and integrity commission, which has the power to initiate things, not just wait for the Prime Minister to take 4 days to decide whether or not he's actually going to refer someone to the independent ethics advisor. It's just not good enough. And we need those big ticket items, in my view, because the public has been sold a very poor deal over the last few years with a government that appears, I'm not talking about you as an individual, Jessie, a government and successive Tory governments that appear to just go, I don't like this, let's dissolve Parliament. I don't like this, let's just change the rules retrospectively. I don't like this, but I'm going to have to suck it up because you buy me a bit of credit on the back benches, so I'll just keep you where you are without referring you to the independent ethics advisor. It's not good enough. And I, as Shadow Leader of the House, if I get to be actual Leader of the House, I'll be helping sort out everything I just said.